Everyone, whatever the case may be, wherever you are, and welcome to the CCLM's webinar on the 2030 Nature Strategy. For those of you just joining, my name is Danielle Debates, and I will be your host today. I am located in Winnipeg, and I would like to respectfully acknowledge that Winnipeg is located on Treaty 1 territory and the heartland of the Métis people. The water that sustains life here is sourced from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation. With this reflection and the gratitude I feel for being able to connect my feet to this land, I walk this journey of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. I invite you to reflect on where you are situated and to reflect on your journey on this path that we walk together. I'm grateful for each of you taking the time to be present today. We have the choice of many options, and I don't take it for granted that we are here now together. Before we jump into this webinar, I would like to say a few words about the CCLM, which I hope everyone on the call today has had an opportunity to visit or use the website. The CCLM was launched back in April 2020. It was built with the vision to connect practitioners working across Canada's diverse landscapes to current and relevant resources. In 2019, 5 collaborating organizations came together and identified that there was no central place to share, exchange information and learnings in conservation and land reclamation. The founding members included Innotech Alberta, ACCC, representing the National Boreal Caribou Knowledge Consortium, Natural Resources Canada, specifically the Canada Forest Service, Ducks Unlimited Canada, and the Northern American Institute of Technology, or NAIT, specifically their Center for Boreal Research. We also want to thank our other supporters who have kept the CCLM portal active and growing. This includes Pathways Alliance, Alberta Innovates, the Grand Prairie Regional Innovation Network, Alberta Land Use Knowledge Network, the Northern Caribou Canada Portal, and Fuse Consulting. The results of this collaboration has been to create this powerful go-to site for all things related to conservation and land management. There are now over 3,000 resources within the portal, and this number continues to grow daily as we grow in our membership. It has 4 main hubs and has welcomed over 65,000 users since it was launched. In addition, we recently released the Indigenous-led Conservation Hub to bring together and spotlight Indigenous leadership and conservation. Now, if you're thinking, I need to be a part of this, or I need my resources to be linked to this tool, please feel free to reach out to us after the call, and we will figure out how you can best be part of the CCLM. We are very pleased to be hosting today's panel discussion on the 2030 Nature Strategy, and I encourage you to please contribute to this conversation by putting your questions or comments into the chat. If time allows, we may have the opportunity to pose some of your questions to our panelists. If you'd like to ask your questions in French in the chat, please do so. Today's webinar will be moderated by Ryan Lenaud. Ryan is a science policy analyst with NRCan. Our first panelist is Christian Malouin. Christian is a manager with Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service. Christian, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Certainly. Bonjour. Hi, everyone. Thank you. Very glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation and the opportunity. So I am, as mentioned, a manager at Canadian Wildlife Service, Environment and Climate Change Canada, responsible for a number of programs such as priority species under the Pan-Canadian approach to transform species at risk conservation, as well as the habitat stewardship programs for species at risk, and also involved under in the 2 Billion Trees program, specifically components related to habitat restoration.
Thank you, Christian. Our second panelist is Megan Lafferty. Megan is Manager of Land Protection Measures with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. Megan, would you like to take a moment to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks. I'm really pleased to be here. As Danielle said, I work with the Nature Conservancy of Canada. I'm part of our conservation policy and planning team. So I have the privilege of working with our folks who are on the ground across the country, focusing really specifically on all the different ways that conservation happens, and with a strong focus on the strategic partnerships that it'll take us to meet these ambitious goals and targets that have been set. So happy to be here.
Thank you, Megan. We are also fortunate to have Hugo Marin joining us as our guest speaker. Hugo is a manager with Environment and Climate Change Canada's Canadian Wildlife Service. Hugo will be providing us with an overview of the 2030 Nature Strategy that we're all excited to hear more about. Hugo, would you like to start with a brief introduction of yourself before continuing with your presentation?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Daniel, and good afternoon, good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of this session. So I'm a manager within the National Biodiversity Policy Division at the Canadian Wildlife Service. My team has been responsible for putting on engagement activities around development of what we released last June, Canada's 2030 Nature Strategy, that I'll be discussing a bit in a couple of minutes. And I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe people around the Gatineau, Ottawa area.
I think we just continue on with your presentation, Hugo. Great.
Okay, so we'll get started. So I have a couple of slides to just support the presentation. I thought that maybe I would quickly touch on the Convention on Biological Diversity. So there are three Rio Convention, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and then the United Nations Convention on Land Degradation and to combat desertification. So those are the three Rio Convention. They date back to 1992. Canada was the first industrialized country to ratify the CBD in the late 1992. And as a response, the government of Canada, along with federal, with provincial and territorial governments, developed Canada's biodiversity strategy, published in 1995. So there is that initial response to the CBD by Canada in 1995. The Conference of Parties is the governing body of the convention. The Conference of Parties meet once every 2 years, unlike the Conference of Parties for the Climate Change Convention, which meets every 2 years, which meet every year, sorry. For the CBD COPs, they do happen once every 2 years. What initiated the work around the development of the 2030 Nature Strategy was a huge outcome at COP15, which took place in Montreal in December of 2022. The negotiation around a post-20 global biodiversity framework had been happening for quite some time and had to be sort of postponed and delayed because of the COVID-19 pandemic. But in December of 2022, parties to the CBD adopted the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. The event was the biggest CBD COP ever in terms of participation. With respect to the Canadian delegation, there were a lot of diversity from governments, but also from national Indigenous organizations and Indigenous communities, NGOs, representation from the private sector. So big success in terms of participation as well, and in terms of side events. So that's the starting point, I would say, to the presentation. Amy, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So I give an overview of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. So essentially, it is akin to the Paris Agreement that was adopted in at Paris for climate change. So the framework is extremely comprehensive and very ambitious as well. It includes 4 global goals to 2050, 23 global targets to 2030, a monitoring framework with 26 headline indicators that all parties will have to report upon. It's a framework that touches on all aspects of nature conservation and sustainable use, with roles for governments, businesses, indigenous people, women, civil society, and key sectors of the economy. A couple of highlights from the framework: a quantified target of 30% of land and oceans conserved by 2030. A similar quantified target in terms of degraded ecosystems being under restoration by 2030. Some commitments to address all 5 direct drivers of global biodiversity loss. Those are land and sea use change, overexploitation, climate change, invasive alien species, and pollution. So those are the 5 key drivers of biodiversity loss globally. But it includes also targets that address indirect drivers, so consumption patterns, lack of information to make adequate decision-making, etc. It also is a framework that recognizes the interconnection of climate change and biodiversity, and makes some room for what we often refer to as nature-based climate solutions, and the importance of relying on nature and conserving nature, building up resilience to both mitigate climate change, but also to adapt. And finally, there are a couple of targets that are focused on resource mobilization and capacity building. Amy, maybe for you, there's a comment in the chat. Thanks for changing the slide. So those are the 23 targets of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. They're grouped in 3 buckets, 3 themes. So the first 8 that are sort of colored in green are the targets that are intended to reduce threats to biodiversity. So those are the more traditional conservation types of targets, with spatial planning, restoration, species recovery, protected and conserved areas, etc. The ones that are more of salmon colored are the targets that are intended to meet people's needs. So that's the one of the key objective of the CBD is the sustainable use of genetic of biodiversity, of resources, of nature. And so the targets that are from 9 to 12 to 13, sorry, are intended to meet people's needs. And then the last group in sort of dark blue are targets that are more targets that tools and solutions to support the implementation of the target. So you know, some mainstreaming of biodiversity values into decision-making at all levels, government, industry, and different types of social institutions. Some targets in terms of sustainable consumption, the role of businesses in terms of disclosure, etc., sharing information to support better decision-making and transparency, accountability, participation to decision-making by indigenous people, women, girls, youth, targets about resource mobilization. I've touched on this quickly already, but in terms of capacity building, technical transfer, financial resources, addressing negative incentives that are harmful to biodiversity, but also increasing the positive incentives that generate positive outcomes on the landscape. So 23 targets grouped into 3 themes: reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs, and then tools and solution for implementation. You can go to the next slide, Amy, please. So that's sort of the timeline that we worked with. So once the Kunming-Montreal GBF was adopted, parties to the CBD had about 2 years to update their national biodiversity strategies and action plans, NBSAP. So that's CBD lingo, but essentially parties to the CBD have been working on updating their strategies and action plan as we did. So in terms of the different moments or steps that took place, I won't talk about the the pre-COP15 activities that we held, and I'll focus on the first engagement phase, really, that was in the spring of 2023 with the national symposium and online survey. We organized several targeted engagement sessions with various groups, from youth to philanthropy to NGOs to different sectors, to indigenous organizations. We did also receive several submissions from different organizations. So we took all of that into account and started to work on drafting Canada's new NBSAP, and trying to reflect the various views that have been shared with us during that first engagement phase. And in the fall, we were revising the document with province and territories, with the National Advisory Committee. So that's an expert body that is making recommendation to Minister Guilbeault. We did engage again with the national indigenous organizations. And so we revised and had a document that was fairly solid and fairly comprehensive by December of 2023. That document was released. It's the milestone document. And from that time, we did open for an additional 60 days of consultation on what was proposed in the milestone document. Again, some engagement activities, a lot of feedback, written feedback from various organizations based on the milestone document, to lead us to June 13 of this year of 2024, when we released Canada's 2030 national nature strategy, sorry. So if we go to the next slide, it is our NBSAP, to use the CBD language, and it really is charting a path for how Canada will be implementing the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework domestically. There's a shared vision, some missions that I'll get into on the next slide. And it has many different elements. It's close to a 200-page document that is fairly comprehensive, and that reflects a huge amount of input that we got from the various engagement phase. There's the maybe the link is not working, but it was shared in the chat at the beginning of the session. So I trust that everyone will be able to go on the website and look at the strategy, at leisure with depending on your own personal interest or professional interest. But I'll just touch on a couple of elements before the final slide. So it has a strategy part, like the front end is more like the strategy. It includes perspective from national indigenous organizations. And then the action plan part has implementation plans for all 23 Kunming Montreal targets. We have profiles of what's being done in provinces and territories. And we also have a high-level overview of the domestic biodiversity monitoring framework, which includes the 26 headline indicators that all parties to the CBD have to report on, plus 29 domestic specific to Canada indicators that will enhance our reporting capacity. So if we go to the final slide, that's sort of a nice visual that captures the main elements of the strategy with the 2050 vision, 2030 mission. While it's important to be clear about what we want to do, it's also important to be clear about how we will get there. And so the pillars are really, key elements that are guiding the work forwards. The ones that we have there on the slides are Indigenous rights and reconciliation, all of government, all of society approach, resilient economy, the importance of underground action, the importance of using and making available the best science and knowledge, and on that, including obviously on par Indigenous knowledge and science. And then, working with an integrated and holistic approach, because while the targets are sort of important individually, they really make for an integrated package that is where the success on one target really contributes to the whole. And there are multiple co-benefits, in the sense that if you're making good grounds, good progress in terms of ecosystem restoration, you're obviously will also be getting benefits in terms of habitats and species recovery. So that in that sense, an integrated approach is critical. And the areas of activities that I've highlighted there are the ones that you will see in the strategy, and they are grouped using the same three themes that the GBF targets are organized in. So reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs, and then deploying tools and solutions. The nature strategy is not a standalone piece. It really complements and is complemented by other significant federal strategies and initiatives, in terms of climate change, in terms of plastic and pollution. So it is part of the overall nature and sustainability agenda, and is building from existing initiatives, but also pushing forward in terms of the being aligned with the ambition of the Kunming Montreal GBF. I'll maybe quickly mention that COP16, so the next COP is taking place in end of October, early November in Colombia. So during that meeting, parties will be able to assess how the process of updating NBSAP has been going, what are the challenges, the remaining challenges, any lessons learned, and it will be an initial stock take, if I could use that word, that will sort of position for the real implementation that will follow. And there will also be some discussion and negotiations around finalizing some of the headline indicators for which the methodologies are still not fully fleshed out. In terms of reporting requirements under the CBD, parties will be expected to report on progress in early 2026 and then in 2029. And I think I'll stop it here. Hopefully I'm within the time allocated, and we can go to Ryan, I think, with
That was great. Thank you.
facilitating.
Thank you, Hugo, for that presentation and setting context for our discussions ahead. I really like to see that vision of all Canadians reestablishing their relationship and honoring their responsibility to nature. I will pass it over to Ryan to moderate our panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Danielle. And thank you, Hugo. We'll just jump right into it and start with our first question. So our first question that we have today is for Christian. So what funding or resources are available to support the implementation of Target 2 restoration projects?
Thanks for the question, Ryan, and hi again, everyone. I would like also to acknowledge that I'm joining you as well from the Gatineau, Ottawa region on the unceded traditional territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. So before diving into the specific funding sources, I'd like to emphasize that the federal government, through the GBF Canada's Nature Strategy, recognizes the urgency of scaling up restoration efforts, especially given the rapid degradation of ecosystems across Canada and globally. Certainly not a situation unique to Canada. And we don't have to look too far to see the impact of that degradation, notably on wildlife species. So protecting land and meeting, which is now Target 3, 30 by 30, is important, but is no longer sufficient to reverse the trend. And we're witnessing a necessary shift in the conservation paradigm toward a dual focus of protection and restoration. So at Environment and Climate Change Canada, ECCC, our mandate is to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 and achieve a full recovery for nature by 2050, as Hugo mentioned as well. And that reflects this desired shift. In terms of federal investments, since 2018, the government of Canada has committed over $12 billion to its nature agenda, covering conservation, ecosystem restoration, species protection, and natural climate solutions. And restoration is an integral part of these investments. At COP15 as well, there was another announcement. It was Canada's initial pledge to the Bund Challenge that was launched in Montreal that helped identify and organize the national funding programs supporting restoration activities. And these initiatives, spawning from remediation, reforestation, and other restoration efforts, are delivered by a diverse group of partner organizations. So in terms of implementing Target 2, and Hugo mentioned it, that's the other 30 by 30 objective. Canada is building on its existing programs and successful models of partnerships, such as the North American Waterfall Management Plan, or NAWAP, which has a proven track record in biodiversity gains. Some key funding sources include ENL, so Enhanced Nature Legacy, with an investment of $2.3 billion until 25-26. There's the Natural Climate Solutions Fund, that's a $5 billion investment until 2030-31. and that includes programs like the 2 Billion Trees program with ongoing open calls and ECCC Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund. There was also an announcement for the investment towards project finance for permanence. That's $800 million for Indigenous-led conservation initiatives in 4 areas in Canada. And there's the Habitat Stewardship for Species at Risk program as well that is also providing funding for restoration activities. Now, achieving Target 2 as well as other international commitments such as the Bund Challenge and the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration will require cross-departmental, whole-of-government collaboration. And as such, at the federal level, Target 2 is co-led by Fisheries and Oceans Canada on the aquatic marine ecosystem side of things, and we at ECCC focuses on terrestrial ecosystems. But also, we work closely with other partners such as Parks Canada, NRCan, and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. A good example of cross-departmental collaboration is how ECCC works closely with NRCan to provide policy, technical support in the delivery of the 2 Billion Trees program in order to foster biodiversity co-benefits from forest restoration work. There are also other initiatives such as the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan, or FICSAP, which involves 16 federal organizations that also demonstrate how coordinated actions advance restoration efforts. Obviously, meeting this ambitious target is not something the federal government can do alone. It does require, as I said, a whole of government, but also a whole of society approach involving provincial, territorial governments, but also members of civil society, and most importantly, Indigenous leadership. Programs like Indigenous Guardians Program and the Aboriginal Fund for Species at Risk play a critical role in supporting Indigenous partners to lead restoration efforts. And Indigenous collaboration, knowledge, and leaderships are essential not only to meet Target 2, but for other targets that Hugo listed before, including Target 22, aiming at ensuring participation in decision-making related to biodiversity for everyone. So this is why collaboration with partners is and will continue to be essential for us at being successful at meeting those targets. And by working with organizations like Nature Conservancy of Canada and Megan and other CCLM collaborators, we aim to advance restoration, share best practices, and ensure adaptive management and ongoing learning as we move forward.
Thank you, Christian. Just as a response to some of the comments here, would it be possible to maybe list some of those programs you just mentioned in the chat, or if you have any links for some of those programs, possibly to throw those on the chat if that's an option?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah,
we'll do that.
Excellent, thank you. And so before moving on to our next question, we'll just open up the same question to give the opportunity to anybody else on the panel if they'd be interested in answering this question. So we'll just open up the floor if anybody would like to jump in.
Sure, I can share something that just in terms of the resources available to support implementation of Target 2 restoration projects. One area of work that Nature Conservancy of Canada is doing is developing decision support tools that help inform where's the most important area to work, and then what should you do once you're working there. And so we're really aiming to democratize data and access to this technology to support decision-making tools. And so that can be aimed at a variety of conservation actions, but certainly restoration can be one of them. So we're happy to kind of share more information on these prioritization tools if it would be helpful.
Great, thanks, Megan. Okay, so moving on to our next question, which will be for Megan. How will your conservation projects be adapted or expanded to align with the 2023 nature strategy? So over to you, Megan.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. So Nature Conservancy of Canada has an ambitious strategic plan that will bring us through to 2030, and that was really by design, knowing at the time that it was written that the Kunming Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework was coming, and subsequently Canada's nature strategy. And it is quite well aligned with Canada's nature strategy. I'd say it touches on all of the 6 pillars that Hugo outlined earlier. For Nature Conservancy of Canada, we really want to contribute to both national and international conservation targets. And we're committed to doing that through conserving at least 1 million additional hectares of land, supporting conservation through reconciliation, and collaborating with diverse partners to unlock solutions. Our goal is really to support resilient landscapes in Canada for people and nature. And we're committed to doing this at the scales needed to reduce, withstand, recover from, and ultimately adapt to the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. And so one of the ways that we're expanding our work is that, as awareness of these challenges continues to permeate society, we're bringing new and ambitious partners to the table to help deliver environmental, social, cultural, and economic benefits with impacts for now and lasting into the future. And so as an example of that, we're working with corporate partners to develop carbon protocols for peatland and grassland habitats to really try and incentivize private investment in these conservation priorities. And we're also really taking an evidence-based approach, encompassing information, methods, and insights, both from science and Indigenous knowledge systems to inform the areas where we work. Sorry, I'll slow down on my next response. I get excited.
No problem. Thanks a lot, Megan. And again, opening up the same question to the other panelists if they'd like to answer the question.
That would be me. But maybe Hugo, don't hesitate to pipe in. For us, the national nature strategy is really now the biodiversity roadmap that is being used to align, our current priority setting exercise, current and also future, in the future moving forward. So it is very much the blueprint that will guide future activities, funding, moving forward.
Thanks, Christian. Hugo, did you want to jump in or?
No, I think nothing really to add to what Christian just mentioned. Really, it is the nature strategy. It really is sort of a map, and will be our key document moving forward in terms of the nature agenda.
Great, thank you very much. All right, moving on to our next question. This one will be for Christian. Is there a way for others to see which degraded areas are high priority and which areas have been effectively restored?
I think before we can fully address this question specifically, we need to develop a robust conceptual framework for restoration, a national framework, that is. And as highlighted in the Target 2 implementation plan, one of our first critical steps is defining key terms like degradation, degraded areas, priority areas for restoration, and effective restoration within the Canadian context. And establishing these definitions will allow us to better communicate progress and identify priorities afterwards. I'll also say that we are hoping to benefit from information from the implementation of Target 1. That one is about spatial planning in order to inform priority areas for restoration. So we're really trying to build synergies, avoid duplications, and how we're going about implementing all of the targets. While there are already internationally recognized definitions and methodologies, including guidance from the CBD in collaboration with the FAO and restoration experts, we need to tailor these to Canada's unique ecological and cultural landscapes. Also, as Hugo mentioned this, as a signatory to other Rio conventions, Canada is working to align our domestic definitions and reporting with global efforts on land degradation and restoration in order to ensure coherence across frameworks. ECCC and other federal partners are exploring ways to improve our ability to identify map degraded lands and waters, as well as track and measure ecosystem restoration activities. Reporting efforts will initially focus on, again, what Hugo mentioned, that's the domestic biodiversity monitoring framework, the target 2 indicators, in this case, specifically areas under restoration. Very interested to hear more about Megan's and NCC efforts towards that. Ongoing efforts to restore Great Lakes areas of concerns, which is an indicator that has been reported through the Canadian Environmental Sustainability Indicators, CESI. And lastly, progress tracking under the Bund Challenge. So several organizations in Canada already have the mandate and capacity to support information sharing related to restoration, and we welcome ongoing discussions and collaborations to expand this work. And we also need to take into considerations that determining what constitutes effective restoration is highly contextual. Engaging with local stakeholders, rights holders is critical to understand what restoration success looks like. This is why one of the 10 key principles under the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration emphasizes that ecosystem restoration must be tailored to local ecological, cultural, and socioeconomic context. So just to wrap it up, Brian, while Canada is working toward clearer definitions and improving monitoring, it's essential that restoration efforts are co-designed with local communities and align with international standards, ensuring that everyone's voice is included in defining restoration priorities and success.
Thank you, Christian. And like before, I'll now provide an opportunity for either Megan or Hugo to answer the question if they'd like to, or if they'd like to add on to anything Christian said.
Sure. I mean, this is a topical question, kind of building on what I shared previously. This is another area where NCC's work has shifted, or Nature Conservancy of Canada's work. I think previously, as we looked at prioritizing areas to work, we focused on, the best habitat in quotes, whereas now we're really looking at where can we have the most impact for a resilient landscape, and that may be looking in degraded areas and looking at restoring them, as opposed to focusing only on areas that perhaps haven't been degraded to the same extent. And so this is an area where we're also applying those two tools that I mentioned to work.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll move on to question number 4. This one will be directed to Megan. And so what new research or field work will you undertake to address key biodiversity concerns highlighted in the strategy?
So we have a science and research program at Nature Conservancy of Canada. It has a couple different aspects, including a Weston Science and Research Fellowship program, where there are graduate students across Canada conducting research that supports the work that NCC is doing. And so we have lots that we learn from those. In fact, our first fellow just recently defended his thesis. But one area that I will highlight, because it's particularly exciting, is around ecological connectivity. And so I think most folks on this call will probably know that this is a key biodiversity concern. But right now, there's actually significant knowledge gaps that are hindering our ability to make decisions and measure progress in support of connectivity. So I'm really excited to be able to share that Nature Conservancy of Canada has started a multi-year connectivity research project to help address these gaps. And this research is being done in 2 pieces. The first is around compiling the most comprehensive data set of human landscape modification in Canada, and then using that to map and measure the connectedness of Canada's network of protected and conserved areas. And so you may have heard before of the Human Footprint Index, but the human landscape modification goes one step further in terms of informing connectivity. So for example, in the Human Footprint Index, a road is a road, but I think we all know that a small gravel road has a different impact than a 4-lane highway. And so going one step further into human landscape modification will help to inform decisions we make around connectivity. And then the second piece of that project is looking at different thresholds of connectivity in different ecosystems and how a variety of management actions could increase or decrease connectivity. And that'll help us understand the effectiveness and feasibility of these actions in different ecosystems across the country. So there may be actions we think are good for connectivity, but this research will help us really understand the impact that they're having. And so we're doing this through case studies across the country. Right now, they'll be in British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Nova Scotia. And part of this research is a real commitment to share the results of what we learn, so that all land authorities throughout Canada and beyond can really benefit from what we're learning. So I'm excited to share that as it becomes available, and stay tuned.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Megan. Sounds some interesting research coming our way. So again, opening up the question to the other two panelists, or Christian or Hugo, if you'd be interested to answer the question.
Yeah, I think I'm super interested to learn more, Megan, about the more you talk about it, the more I will give you a call later on. I think this is a question. So I work for Canadian Wildlife Service. There's also colleagues from this science and technology branch that are definitely involved in aligning their research work against some of the priorities and action items under the nature strategy. One thing I'll say though is that we will continue through our existing programs, and some of them I mentioned earlier, to support research and field work to address some of those concerns, including the recovery of species at risk that often involves restoration and field work and monitoring to better understand population dynamics, habitat requirements, and so on and so forth.
Great. Thank you, Christian. All right. So moving on to question number 5. This one is for Christian. So Target 2 mentions information on restoration efforts is currently fragmented and dispersed among numerous organizations. Establishing a common platform to pull together information from various sources would facilitate information exchange, foster collaboration, promote strategic planning and implementation, and streamline the reporting process. So how can the CCLM support the information exchange and collaboration?
Okay, so what do we mean by information being fragmented as it was written into the strategy? So restoration efforts in Canada involve a diverse range of partners, including various jurisdictions, Indigenous communities, civil society organizations, private landowners, private sectors, and so on. And these activities are occur at different scales and for various purposes, such as fulfilling legal mandates, restoring critical habitat for species at risk, or rewilding areas for hunting. At the national level, multiple federal departments manage funding programs that support these activities, further contributing to this fragmentation of information and data. And also, project reports, while often required by the various programs, are not always publicly shared due to data confidentiality concerns or the lack of a centralized repository. So information sharing is certainly crucial, and it is one of the 3 pillars of effective restoration, as identified in the FAO and CBD draft resource guide to Target 2, alongside broad stakeholders engagement and adaptive management. So sharing best practices, innovative science, and even lessons learned from less successful initiatives is vital to inform future restoration projects and guiding science and policy. Through the public consultations that Hugo mentioned earlier, many organizations have emphasized the need for some sort of platform or coordination hub for information exchange, and this call for greater collaboration aligns with the need to improve strategic planning and implementation. The CCLM is already contributing to this effort, if you ask me, by hosting resources on its website. So just for fun, yesterday I did a keyword search for restoration on the search engine of the CCLM platform, and I got 655 hits. So there's already a rich source of information there related to all kinds of restoration efforts. But also CCLM is supporting and organizing webinars like this one today that brings together practitioners, researchers, and policymakers and foster this cross-pollination of ideas. So these initiatives help bridge knowledge gaps, foster collaboration, and ensure that restoration efforts align with broader goals like biodiversity conservation and climate change adaptation. Moving forward, the CCLM will continue to engage its member and other stakeholders to facilitate the implementation and reporting of Target 2 just by doing what it's already doing. And we're committed to explore additional opportunities to work with CCLM and other partners to align restoration efforts with broader objectives, ensuring that the benefits of these initiatives are maximized across multiple sectors. So I would certainly also welcome any insights from CCLM community that is participating today on how they envision their role in supporting the GBF and the achievement of Target 2 in the future.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Christian. And again, opening up the same question to Megan or Hugo, if you'd like to answer, feel free.
Sure, maybe I'll echo Christian's kind of celebration of CCLM as a platform. I think there's so much work to be done as we strive to meet these targets. And so being able to share resources and share knowledge so that we can build on one another's efforts and work together is really valuable. And so having platforms like CCLM that make that possible is wonderful. And I also really want to build on a point you made, Christian, about where there were errors and sharing that. And I think that's something we all tend to do, and I'm doing it a bit on this webinar as we talk about our big successes and our things that we're most proud of. But I think we learn so much in where we goof or where we did something wrong. And I'd love to see us as a conservation community get to a place where we can share that and share what we learned and kind of fail forward together because we're going to have to try new things. This global biodiversity framework is calling for transformative change. And so I think we won't get it perfect all the time. And so being able to learn from one another, both the highs and lows, I think is a really valuable thing.
Agreed. All right. Thank you, Megan. So moving on to our next question, question number 6. How will you measure, and this question is for Megan, sorry. How will you measure the impact of your programs and projects in relation to the strategy's goals?
Yeah, so I think we actually will take quite a similar approach to what's laid out in Canada's strategy. And what I mean by that is Nature Conservancy Canada will measure both the overall resiliency of the landscape and then also our own specific contribution of our own activities to creating and sustaining those resilient landscapes. And we're also, and this is a newer area for us, measuring nature's contribution to people and their quality of life. So we have some existing metrics that we're already using, including hectares in protection, hectares restored, tons of carbon sequestered, and people's proximity to protected and conserved areas. But I'd say as this new global biodiversity framework and Canada's nature strategy are rolling out, we also recognize that we need other ways to measure our impact to really capture the true breadth of our work and the influence that it's having on landscape resiliency. And also, how it contributes to Canada's nature strategy and Canada's domestic monitoring framework. And so we're in the process of kind of developing or adapting an expanded suite of metrics that'll help us to measure that. And I guess these metrics are important to understand impacts, but I'd say they're also important to inform our future work. We're really committed to adaptive management. So as we see what our impact has been, how can we learn from that and change and revise our conservation actions accordingly?
Great, thank you, Megan. And again, opening up the question to Hugo or Christian, if you'd like to jump in.
Well, I can start. Maybe Hugo. Again, you please don't hesitate to add. Hugo already kind of mentioned it. I think one of the main mechanisms that we're going to measure the impact of what Canada is doing towards the strategies, targets, and goals, objectives will be through the reporting under the CBD, and the first one will be in 2026, followed by the one in 2029, if I remember correctly what Hugo told us. For restoration specifically, again, going back to the Bund Challenge, our first national report on this pledge to have 19 million hectares of land under restoration by 2030 is going to be released later in the year. So that's another way that we can track and measure progress of our the programs that are under the One Challenge. Then I won't get into the details, but it goes back to the previous questions about fragmentation of data and information. So how to create bridges between the various information sources will also be critical, and it's really right now a challenge for like the federal government, obviously, and I'm sure it's common issues elsewhere as well. So we are developing internal tools that will better allow us to track results from all of the various nature-focused programs that we have currently, but also in the future.
Thanks, Christian. Okay, so we have time for maybe one or two more questions. Just a reminder to everyone in the audience, feel free to ask your questions. There'll be a period for audience questions after, so feel free to add your questions in the chat if you have any. But another question before we move on to that section would be for Christian and Hugo. And the question would be, what indicators or metrics will you use to assess progress towards the strategy's goal?
I think I'll let Hugo take that one.
I mean, to me, the way I understand the question is really what we have put forward in terms of the biodiversity monitoring framework, the domestic biodiversity monitoring framework, which is included in the strategy. So it has all 26 headline indicators that are part of what has been adopted during COP15, plus 29 domestic indicators that complement certain elements of the targets, because when one reads the target text, there are quite, for some of those targets, there are multiple elements in there. Really, it's a bit limiting to try to track progress with respect to multiple elements with only one or two indicators. So that's the reason why we, as a federal working group, we're thinking about the what was needed in addition to the required headline indicators. That's why we felt that we had to enrich that with additional indicators, and maybe one sharing something that is not reflected in the high-level overview of the domestic biodiversity monitoring framework, but which has been touched on and mentioned as a way, as something to explore in the near future, is given the critical role of indigenous led actions in the overall strategy, and it really is quite prominent in the strategy, and for a very good reason. There's that potential area of enriching the monitoring with what sometimes are referred to as biocultural indicators. So yeah, I think the short answer is that the reporting will be done based on the set of indicators that is included in the strategy, but this is something that we are working to enrich over time, and between, for example, 2026, when we'll do our first progress report, and 2029, the set of indicators that will be used to assess progress will likely be, different and better.
Thank you, Hugo. Megan, is there anything you wanted to add to that, or we can move
There
on to the
actually
next?
is, and I didn't think
Okay.
there would because I'd already talked about metrics. But
Go
one of the
ahead.
things that Hugo said around how many of the targets have a lot of pieces, and I think that's something really important to keep in mind as we look at individual metrics, is that it can become all about something we can put a number on, and some things are easier to measure than others. And we need to remember that it's a combination of things that means the success of the target. So example, target 3, we talk a lot about 30 by 30, but that 30% needs to be well connected, equitably governed, effectively managed. And so it's really about the package deal. And so I think that's something to keep really important to keep in mind, and certainly something top of mind for Nature Conservancy of Canada as we think about measuring the impacts of our work.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, so I think we have time for one last question for the panel before we move on to the audience questions. So this one will be for Megan. How will you engage with policymakers and other stakeholders to ensure that the strategy's successful, to ensure the strategy's successful implementation?
Yeah, so I'd say Nature Conservancy Canada takes a nonpartisan and evidence-based approach, and that often makes us an ideal solutions finder and policy problem solver. We offer a wide range of expertise and tools, and do have a track record of success in working with all levels of government, Indigenous nations and communities, industries, other NGOs, and individuals, kind of from coast to coast to coast. We really welcome the chance to work with anyone where there's opportunity to develop creative solutions that counter biodiversity loss and help mitigate and adapt to climate change. And so one example of this is a recently completed Incomplu Conservancy in British Columbia. So Nature Conservancy of Canada helped to broker a multi-party agreement under which Interfor Corporation relinquished their forest tenure in the Incomplu Valley. And now this 58,000 hectare rare inland temperate rainforest in southeastern BC is being protected by the province and managed in collaboration with local First Nations. So we really like being able to bring multiple parties together and work towards solutions collaboratively. We also have a wide variety of subject matter experts within NCC who also can get called on by governments, by research institutions, by industry fora to provide expert input and advice into conservation processes and decision-making bodies. And we do also engage with and contribute to global policy discussions, especially under the Convention on Biological Diversity and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we also, as an associate member of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, actively engage in that community and those discussions, in particular through the World Commission on Protected Areas. So we are very excited to be attending COP16 and supporting Canada's efforts there.
Thank you, Megan. And again, would Christian or Hugo like to also respond to that question? A reminder, the question was, how will you engage with policymakers and other stakeholders to ensure the strategy's successful implementation? No? Okay, no problem.
Well, okay, Ryan, I'll
Yeah.
just mention just quickly, and I see another question in the chat that is, I'm going to try to answer both at the same time. I think one of the key way for us to be engaging with jurisdictions and other stakeholders and provincial and territorial governments moving forward is one of the main vehicle is are the nature agreements that we're negotiating with jurisdictions. So right now, we developed and negotiated nature agreements with Yukon, BC, Nova Scotia. And this is really a novel way for us to be developing those type of collaborations. And it really allows to roll under one agreement many different nature-related activities. So, for example, like sometimes 2 billion trees funding will be kind of rolled under this broader nature agreement, as well as a number of species at risk focused funding. So that's part of the answer. And another way, of course, for us at CWS is through conservation agreements under Section 11 of the Species at Risk Act. And that's really a mechanism that is available to us to work closely with well, province and territories, but also any other organizations or Canadians out there, and work on joint priorities.
Thanks, Christian. And so thanks for answering that question as well. That question came from Bev, who is actually the first treasurer and funder of the CCLM over 5 years ago. So thanks, Bev, for that question. And thanks, Christian, for answering it. So now I believe I'll pass it back over to Danielle before we move on to more questions from the audience.
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, Christian, Megan, and Hugo for your insights and thoughtful responses to open it up on the topic of fail culture and sharing my thesis 20-something years ago, riparian forest restoration and invasive species. I went back 2 years later to my site to see that flood had eroded much of my efforts. So big takeaway there was, start it, keep at it, and probably yesterday was the right time to get on it and not wait. But thank you for the audience questions as well. Keep them coming into the chat. We will have opportunity to hear from the panelists on these. And before we do this, and while we let the questions come in, I want to mention that a survey for the webinar will be placed in the chat. In this survey, you'll be able to submit requests for future topics and request to be contacted for more information about the CCLM. And with that, Ryan, back to you to pose the questions from the audience to our panelists, if there are some that have not yet been answered.
Okay, so once again, a reminder to please ask your questions if you have any. You can ask them in the chat, and then we will try to read them if we have time. So the first question was already answered here. Going to the second question. We've seen a lot more Indigenous-led restoration work lately. The 2 Billion Trees program has worked great in this regard with Indigenous stream. So is there anything other or any other initiatives coming up that we can steer our Indigenous partners towards? So we can maybe direct that question to Christian and or Hugo. So go ahead, the floor is yours.
I mentioned a few. It all depends on what are the objectives of the project, or what the proposal is about, and I think that will kind of dictate a little bit what programs and source of fundings are or could be available. So 2 Billion Trees, glad to hear that. As I said, we're closely supporting our colleagues over at NRCan with the delivery of that program. There's the Aboriginal funds for species at risk as well. That is dedicated to species at risk, and that's an ECCC funding. There's also Indigenous focused funding under Nature Smart Climate Solution Fund. That's again, ECCC is responsible for that. Yeah, so that's kind of just top of my head, some of the programs that I am aware of that are kind of have a stream, let's just say, that or that restoration is one of the eligible activities that can be funded.
Thank you, Christian. Anything anybody would like to add to that? And it looks like this question came from the current CCLM chair, Kevin, who is also one of the original initiators and supporters of the CCLM. So thank you, Kevin, for that question. Okay. Moving on to another question here. Are there any specific funding programs to support biodiversity conservation in urban areas? I guess this would be to anyone that's willing to answer the question. Putting up to the floor.
Well, okay, I'll jump in, but I think I was just going to mention focusing specifically on urban areas. That I cannot answer, but again, depending on what the objectives are, if it's about habitat and habitat for species at risk, please look at the Habitat Stewardship Program for Species at Risk. We have our next call coming in a couple of weeks. So if, again, it's linked to Habitat for Species at Risk, that is likely eligible under this program.
Okay, thank Thank you, Christian.
Yeah,
Again,
I mean, quickly, Ryan, sorry
yeah,
to
go ahead.
interrupt you.
Oh, no, go ahead, Hugo.
The example that that I had in mind was the National Urban Parks Program. That is, that might be an answer to your question, although it's quite specific, and it's in terms of numbers. There's planned to have up to 15 of those national urban parks. But that's the other example that I thought about.
All right, thank you very much, Hugo. So while we're seeing here, if there's more questions in the chat, feel free to ask it. In the meantime, I have another question here. I could ask maybe Megan. How will you leverage data and analytics to inform your strategies and track progress?
Sure. So I alluded to this a little bit before we're talking about our tools, but yes, as kind of Canada's largest private land conservation organization, Nature Conservancy of Canada manages a large amount of data related to conservation planning, land securement, and stewardship. And so we're really now investing in more powerful and advanced software that allows us to collect, store, share, and better analyze more data and do it in an efficient way. And so one of the big focuses of that has been our suite of innovative open source prioritization tools that I mentioned before, but I will reiterate. So Where to Work, which involves identifying, prioritizing areas for conservation, and then What to Do, which really helps to prioritize actions to advance conservation once you've decided where to work. And we're really interested in continuing to share this technology and making it more available to other people who may benefit from access to it. And we're also continuing to develop, curate, and share national data sets to address gaps in conservation data to support informed land use planning and decision making. We're doing ongoing assessments, for example, of nature's benefits, such as flood regulation and pollination services. And we share these through both NCC's media and academic papers as they get released.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Anything else to add from the other panelists? Okay, so another question here from maybe Christian and or Hugo. What new or enhanced conservation initiatives will your department undertake to align to the strategy?
I think what we have in the strategy are existing initiatives that have been put in place, some of them more recent. So the number of years during which those initiatives will be ongoing is variable. Christian mentioned some of the programs sort of looking to 2026, others like the Nature Climate Smart Fund going towards 2030. So that's what we are putting forward as of now, and it's premature to mention anything about new initiatives. What we did include in the strategy are some elements under a going further section. So if you go to the implementation plan, for example, for target 2 or for target 1, to give a different example, you'll have a table of current actions, and those actions are carrying on forward in the future. But there's also a section on that touches on going further, and that includes things that the government will look into or explore, meaning that it's on the radar, but we can't really communicate any new initiatives other than what's in the strategy as of now.
Great, thank you, Hugo. Okay, so another question is, could this nature strategy help industry partners doing restoration have more clarity about whether or not their claims meet international standards? So that'll be a question for any one of the panelists willing to answer. So opening it up. I'll repeat the question. Could this nature strategy help industry partners doing restoration have more clarity about whether or not their claims meet international standards?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it goes back to some degree to the questions about definitions and the whole conceptual framework, and also aligning those definitions with other international agreements as well. So by working towards Target 2 implementations, that's very much what we're trying to do, is not duplicating something that exists or creating something that is totally different than what we've agreed on elsewhere, right? So I think once we have that standardized framework for restoration in Canada, hopefully that will give some clarity as to how we collectively in Canada are tracking, monitoring, and reporting on restoration and what we consider to be degraded ecosystems. So I hope it addressed the question.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Christian. Any additional thoughts from the other panelists, from Megan or Hugo?
Just that I think we're really seeing the need for, but also interest from industry to participate in, meeting the Global Biodiversity Framework targets, which is great. And as we continue to get clarity on Canada's nature strategy, being able to kind of match make that with industry interest in supporting those targets, I think will be really important and a really valuable way to move the dial for us.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Megan. Thank you, Christian and Hugo. I think that's a good place to end it. So unless there are any last questions, I think we can pass it back to Danielle for some closing remarks.
Yeah, thank you. I want to thank our speaker, Hugo, and panelists, Megan and Christian, for the fantastic discussion. And thank you, Ryan, for moderating the panel. A big heartfelt thank you and applause to you all. Please don't forget to fill out the survey, which was shared in the chat. Also, please stay tuned for more knowledge exchange seminars that the CCLM will be bringing to you. Be sure to check out the CCLM portal, which is where you can stay up to date on upcoming events and where you can find the resources you need to do the work that you do. And with that, I think we can close off a few minutes early and have a great afternoon or evening wherever you are, everyone.
Merci beaucoup.